a young woman, who was 19 years old at the time, spent her final hours studying how to end her life within the icy and cruel walls of the Tower of London. The Queen of England, Catherine Howard, who had only been in power for a little over 18 months, practiced placing her head on the block that was used by the executioner. She was resolved to meet her end with dignity, rather than the panic that had characterized her confinement. What kind of evil could have caused someone of such a young age to meet such a tragic end? Not only does the solution lay in her alleged adultery, but it also resides in the brutal political machine that was Henry VIII court. In that court, youth, beauty, and innocence were essentially commodities that were consumed and discarded. It is a story that depicts the horrific realities of life under one of England's most oppressive monarchs. And Catherine Howard's story is not only one of the darkest episodes in Tudor history, but it is also one of the most terrifying. She was born into the prominent Howard family around the year 1523, and she was immediately pushed into a world in which women lived exclusively to service the desires of males, with their bodies and lives being deemed expendable in the pursuit of power. Her brief reign as Henry's fifth wife would finally result in her being executed on a chilly February morning in 1542, as well as allegations of treason, the torturing of her allies, and ultimately her own sentence of death. A window into the savage machinery of Tudor justice, where confessions were extracted through agony, where the young and vulnerable were sacrificed to protect the powerful, and where the king's paranoia transformed personal relationships into capital crimes. This is not simply a story about a royal scandal. Rather, it is a window into the savage machinery of Tudor justice. The last days of Catherine Howard's life shed light on the true cost of Henry VIII's reign of terror and the horrific ease with which total authority could take the lives of innocent people. In the year 1540, England was a nation that was undergoing great change as a result of religious unrest and political fear. Henry VIII, who was now in his late 40s, had previously severed his ties with Rome, dismantled the monasteries, and put 2 women to death in his dogged search of a male heir. In order to survive, it was necessary to navigate the increasingly unstable moods and obsessive suspicions of the king, who had turned the court into a hazardous maze of warring groups. Putting their youthful kinswoman, Catherine, in front of the eyes of the elderly king was a chance that the Howards, one of the most ancient noble families in England, saw as a way to regain their authority. The treacherous chief minister of Henry, Thomas Cromwell, had recently orchestrated the disastrous marriage of the king to and of Cleves, and his adversaries saw that he was beginning to show signs of weakness. The Howard group, which was commanded by the Duke of Norfolk, started promoting Catherine as a possible substitute for the German princess who was not wanted. Henry's increasingly grotesque look and foul-smelling leg ulcers made him a figure of revulsion rather than desire, but they understood his weakness for young, lively women who could make him feel virile again. They understood that Henry's weakness was for women who could make him feel virile again. As far as the Howard family's goals were concerned, the timing appeared to be ideal. Cromwell's star was waning, and religious conservatives saw an opportunity to undo the Protestant changes that had swept England. This was a window of opportunity. Catherine, with her stunning appearance and strong ties to the Catholic Church, was a symbol of hope for people who harbored a desire to return to. The ancient faith failed to take into account the king's rising instability and his desire to destroy anyone who threatened his authority or damaged his pride. This was something that they failed to take into consideration. It was a police state in England in the year 1540, where informants were hiding around every corner, where private conversations could be used as evidence of treason, and where the subjects of the king lived in perpetual fear of the knock on the door, which could mean execution. It had become a gilded jail where courtiers smiled while plotting each other's destruction, and where the king's favor might turn overnight into a death sentence. The court itself had become a prison. Throughout her life, Catherine Howard had been subjected to a pattern of neglect and exploitation, experiences that would finally result in her demise. She was sent to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, who was the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk after her father passed away when she was still a little child. This caused her to become an orphan. It was the intention of the Duchess to provide young Catherine with the education and moral supervision that would be appropriate for a nobleman's daughter when she was residing at Chatsworth House and, subsequently, Horsham. On the contrary, it turned out to be a location where she was exposed to adult relationships and sexual knowledge that was well beyond her years. Catherine was allowed to share a dormitory with older ladies who exposed her to the perilous world of hidden romances and clandestine meetings. The Dowager Duchess, an elderly woman who was more interested in her own affairs than in properly monitoring the young women in her care, was the one who made this arrangement. It was at this place that Catherine first learned the skills that would later be used against her: how to conduct secret romances, how to compose love letters, and how to navigate the complex world of sexual politics that governed aristocratic houses. These skills would subsequently be used against her. Catherine, who was just 13 years old at the time, had her first serious connection with Henry Mannix, her music teacher. Henry Mannix was a guy who was substantially older than Catherine. This particular interaction, which most certainly entailed sexual contact, laid the groundwork for a pattern that would continue to torment her for the remainder of her brief life. Mannix, who was aware of the influence he had over his young student, subjected her to the experience of physical intimacy while simultaneously instructing her on how to deceive her guardians on their encounters. Almost immediately after the breakup of her engagement with Mannix, Catherine began a romantic involvement with Francis Darham, a gentleman pensioner who lived in the Duchess's household. Not only did they engage in sexual contact with one another, but they also made commitments to marry and gave each other presents. Their connection was significantly more serious. Afterwards, numerous witnesses stated that they believed a legally binding betrothal had taken place between them, and they referred to each other as husband and wife all during their relationship. The dormitory at Horsham became a place where young women learnt to swim the treacherous seas of desire and ambition. It was a place where discussions were whispered and secrets were shared. There was a casual attitude towards sexuality that existed in the household, where covert meetings were commonplace, and the elderly Duchess remained deliberately unaware of the activities that were taking place beneath her roof, as testified by Catherine's roommates in the future. In the future, Catherine would use these early relationships as a weapon against one another. Catherine's youthful misdeeds were replaced by evidence of her alleged immoral character, and this transformation occurred. The very experiences that ought to have been shielded from harm by responsible people were the basis for allegations of promiscuity and dishonesty, which turned out to be the cause of her death in the end. It was not Catherine Howard's acts as queen that sparked the investigation that would ultimately lead to her downfall. Rather, it was a methodical probe into her background that brought to light the incompetence of her guardians and the illicit connections that had characterized her adolescence. It was this pattern of early sexual connections that became the first pillar of the case against her. While it was normal for many young ladies of her status, it was heartbreaking when viewed through the prism of royal scandal. The path to becoming Henry VIII's fifth bride was built with the wreckage of his previous marriages and the bodies of those who had crossed him. However, by the year 1540, Catherine Howard had already captured the attention of Henry VIII. The pattern that the king followed with his wives had become unsettlingly predictable. Early infatuation, passionate courting, hasty marriage, and then either death or annulment when they failed to deliver the required male heir or when his interest in them diminished. During a time when Henry was especially susceptible to flattery and the illusion of renewed youth, Catherine rose to prominence. This occurred at a time when Henry was particularly vulnerable. From a moment he laid eyes on his Flanders mare, as he cruelly termed her, his fourth marriage to and of Cleves had been a fiasco. He had been married to her for 4 years. Henry was eager for an annulment despite the fact that the marriage had never been consummated. This would allow him to seek other choices that were more appealing to him. The Howard family had a complete and total understanding of the king's mental state. In the past, they had already provided him with one wife, and Bullen, who had met her end on the executioner's block due to her inability to produce a male heir. Now that they had reached this point, they were willing to take a chance on another young woman in their family, betting that Catherine's youthfulness and attractiveness could succeed where and had failed. The Duke of Norfolk Catherine's uncle, did everything in his power to ensure that she was introduced to the world of courtly life with meticulous planning. She was placed in a position where she would serve as Anne of Cleves' maid of honor, which put her in direct contact with the king at a time when he was feeling the most unsatisfied with his present marriage. When compared to the foreign queen that he was so eager to divorce, her attractiveness, vivacity, and apparent innocence offered a striking contrast, a demonstration of an old tyrant's frantic desire to reclaim his youth through the acquisition of a teenager. The king's courtship of Catherine was both pitiful and terrifying. It was a display of the king's passion for Catherine. Henry, who was now enormously overweight, suffering from terrible leg ulcers, and prone to violent mood swings, showered gifts upon the young woman who appeared to find him beautiful despite the fact that his physical and emotional condition had deteriorated significantly. In spite of the fact that she was just 17 years old at the time and had no idea what political forces were influencing her life, Catherine found herself the focus of the most powerful man in England's obsessive attention. She was taught by the Howard family how to respond to the king's overtures, and they instructed her to be charming without being overly forward. The speed with which Henry moved from absolving his marriage to Anne of Cleves to marrying Catherine Howard reveals the extent of his infatuation and his inability to think rationally when he is consumed by desire. Henry is innocent, but he is not naive, and he's always mindful of the ultimate goal of marriage, which is the restoration of power. Within a few short weeks of the finalization of his annulment, Catherine found herself in the position of Queen of England. This status brought with it not only an immense honor, but also an inconceivable risk. A ceremony that was both a celebration and a funeral march took place in July of 1540, just a few weeks after Henry VIII's marriage to Anne of Cleves was declared null and void. Catherine's wedding to Henry VIII consisted of a funeral march. The bride, who was only 19 years old, was about to marry a guy who was nearly 30 years her senior. The man's prior wives had been subjected to a variety of fates, ranging from annulment to execution. During the time that the Howard family was celebrating their return to power, Catherine herself appeared to have a limited understanding of the historical tradition that she was following. It appeared that Catherine's reign was off to a good start in the first few months of her reign. Henry appeared to be happier than he had been in years, as he appeared to be feeling revitalized by the apparent adoration of his young wife. A macabre cycling of royal goods, he lavished her with gifts, including jewels that had belonged to his former wives. This was a manifestation of his callous attitude toward the women he had rejected in the past. The ceremonies, the magnificent attire, and the authority that came with her position were all things that Catherine took great pleasure in because she embraced her role as queen with the passion of a young woman. She demonstrated a caring character by intervening on behalf of convicts, including some who had been convicted for religious reasons. This was the starting point for many people in the courtroom to develop a favorable impression of her. On the other hand, the very characteristics that had drawn Henry to Catherine also made her susceptible to the perilous currents that were present in court life. Although her innate warmth and friendliness were misunderstood by men who saw opportunity in her apparent accessibility, her youth and inexperience made her an easy target for those who attempted to exploit her for their own goals. Her youth and inexperience made her an easy victim. Over the course of this time period, the king's health was gradually declining, which caused him to become increasingly angry and distrustful. While his weight had ballooned to the point where he required mechanical aid to saddle his horse, his leg ulcers had gotten so severe that the smell was visible to everyone around him. Additionally, his weight had made it impossible for him to mount his horse. Due to the fact that he suffered from these bodily problems, he experienced tremendous mood swings, which became unpredictable and hazardous. Almost immediately, Catherine and her family began to experience a great deal of concern due to the fact that she was unable to conceive a child. In addition to the fact that Henry's frantic need for a male heir had previously resulted in the deaths of two of his wives, Catherine was under an incredible amount of pressure to conceive. Due to the fact that she was unable to produce an heir in a timely manner, an atmosphere of tension was generated, which made every element of her behavior susceptible to examination and suspicion. There were spies and informants working in the Queen's household, just like there were in every other royal establishment. These individuals reported every discussion and encounter to a variety of different parties. All of Catherine's words were scrutinized in order to identify any indications of disloyalty or inappropriate behavior. Despite the fact that her private moments were invaded by servants whose primary loyalty was not to her, but rather to those who paid for information about her actions, the fatal attraction that would ultimately destroy Catherine Howard arrived in the figure of Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman who worked in the privy chamber of the king. The young woman was imprisoned in a marriage to a guy who was becoming more and more unpleasant, and she found him irresistible because of his proximity to power and his unmistakable charm. Culpeper, who was around the same age as Catherine and possessed the vibrancy and attractiveness that Henry had long ago lost, embodied all that was lacking on account of her marriage to the king. The beginning of their connection was relatively harmless, consisting of casual discussions and glances exchanged between the two of them. However, with time, it developed into something much more deadly. Because of his position in the king's household, Culpeper had the advantage of having regular access to the royal rooms. He took advantage of this access to pursue a relationship with the queen that both of them were aware had the potential to be fatal. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who had survived the devastation of the Boleyn dynasty only to become involved in the downfall of another queen, was the one who organized the covert meetings that took place between Catherine and Culpeper. The perils of royal scandal should have been more obvious to Jane Boleyn, the widow of George Boleyn, who had been killed alongside Anne Boleyn. She should have grasped them better than anybody else. Despite this, she volunteered to act as the intermediary for the covert romance. Over the course of her trial, Catherine's letters to Culpeper, which she had written in her own hand, would prove to be essential pieces of evidence. These records disclosed not only romantic feelings, but also a level of intimacy that may be construed as treasonous because of the nature of the relationship. It makes my heart to die to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company, she wrote, would be used to present her as an adulteress who had breached both her marriage vows and her duty to the crown. Her comments would be used to paint her as a person who had committed adultery. The actual meetings were held in a number of different locales, ranging from the private chambers of the Queen to hidden spots on royal marches. For the purpose of concealing their activities, the participants went to great efforts, including the use of coded messages and trusted middlemen to arrange their meetings. While it was important for them to take these steps in order to ensure their safety, they also offered evidence of premeditation that ultimately could be used against them. There is a lack of clarity regarding the reasons for Culpeper's pursuit of the relationship. His actions displayed a reckless disrespect for the repercussions that awaited anybody who dared to cuckold the King of England. It is unclear if he was really fascinated with the Queen, seeking political benefit, or simply enjoying the thrill of the illegal connection. No matter the reason, his actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for the consequences. Over the course of several months, the connection developed with an increasing degree of daring and a decreasing amount of prudence. Initially consisting of quick discussions and fleeting glances, the relationship eventually developed into extensive private meetings and passionate communication. There was a clear indication that Catherine and Culpeper had lost sight of the imminent threat. In the midst of the intensity of their feelings and the excitement of their covert romance, they found themselves caught up in things. When Catherine Howard's past finally caught up with her in October of 1541, it was in the most tragic way possible. This was the moment when the walls began to close in on Howard. It was not via rigorous inquiry that the exposure of her previous connections and her current affair came about. Rather, it was through the desperate activities of John Lascelles, a reformer who saw an opportunity to strike at the Catholic Howard faction by exposing the Queen's secrets. This information concerning Catherine's previous relationships was brought to the attention of Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury and a prominent figure in the Protestant community. While working as a servant in the home of the Dowager Duchess, his sister, Mary Hall, had the opportunity to see Catherine's connections with both Henry Mannix and Frances Darham. The timing of this news was particularly distressing, as it occurred just as Henry was celebrating what he felt to be a happy marriage along with his wife. Cranmer was confronted with a precarious predicament. Despite the fact that he was aware that bringing such allegations to the attention of the monarch could lead to another royal execution, he was equally aware that failing to report possible acts of treason could end in him losing his own life. After much debate, he came to the conclusion that the best way to get the information to Henry would be to write it down and send it to him in the form of a letter. This would enable the king to read the allegations in secret rather than it being read out loud. Henry originally reacted to the discoveries with a mixture of astonishment and anger from the beginning. He was adamant that he would not acknowledge the possibility that his young wife, who appeared to adore him, could have been so thoroughly deceitful. As additional evidence came to light, his initial reaction was to punish the messenger. However, as more evidence came to light, his incredulity changed into the icy rage that had characterized his previous interactions with extramarital affairs. The subsequent investigation was carried out with the same sort of systematic ruthlessness that had been characteristic of Henry's past marital troubles. Frances Darham and Henry Mannix were taken into custody and subjected to torture during their interrogation. Their confessions were obtained through the use of the rack and other tools that caused them to be in terrible pain. Catherine was portrayed as a willing participant in sexual encounters that began when she was barely a teenager, according to their testimony, which revealed comprehensive recounts of their experiences with Catherine. Shortly after that, Thomas Culpeper was taken into custody, and during his interrogation, the depth of his relationship with the Queen was disclosed. During the course of the torture, he admitted to having a secret rendezvous with Catherine, but he denied that they had actually completed their relationship. It is not clear whether his confession was honest or whether it was simply an attempt to reduce his guilt while he was under extraordinary and extreme pressure. Another person who was taken into custody was Jane Boleyn, commonly known as Lady Rochford, for her part in enabling the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper. The detailed steps that were taken to conceal the relationship were brought to light during her interrogation, as was the extent to which she had acted as a go-between for the two individuals who were in love. Her evidence would prove to be extremely important in determining whether or not the alleged adultery was committed with premeditation. For the last time, Catherine Howard was incarcerated. On November 14, 1541, she was confined to her quarters while the investigation into her behavior continued. This marked the beginning of the captivity that she was subjected to. Just a few short months earlier, the young queen had been the focal point of court celebrations and royal favor. However, she found herself in a position of complete isolation, with only a select few servants being permitted to attend to her. The conditions under which she was held captive were intended to destroy her spirit and ensure that she would make a complete confession. In addition to being exposed to frequent interrogation by the king's commissioners, she was forbidden access to writing tools, prevented from contacting with anybody outside of her immediate household, and prevented from sharing her thoughts with anyone else. It was just as purposeful and calculated as any other form of physical torture to apply the psychological pressure. The emotional state that Catherine was experiencing at this time period rapidly deteriorated. As a result of her inability to realize the extent to which her world had entirely disintegrated, witnesses stated that she went through bouts of frenzy and catatonic quiet repeatedly. The young woman who had previously been in charge of the riches of an entire country was now unable to have any influence over even the most insignificant aspects of her daily routine. The interrogations focused not just on her recent relationship with Culpeper, but also on her previous romances and the fact that she failed to report them before to her marriage to the king. The commissioners were particularly interested in determining whether she had engaged into a legally binding betrothal with Frances Darham. If she had done so, her subsequent marriage to Henry would have been unlawful and could have been considered treasonous. Catherine's responses to the questions that were asked were inconsistent and frequently contradictory, which reflected both her emotional discomfort and her real bewilderment over the legal ramifications of her previous relationships. Due to her youth and lack of education, she was especially susceptible to the sophisticated legal arguments that were being created against her. She had a difficult time comprehending how activities that she had previously thought to be private could be transformed into proof of treason. Because of the burden that her confinement was putting on her, the Queen's physical condition started to worsen as well. She went through a period of fast weight loss, during which she also experienced insomnia and developed a nervous condition that caused her hands to shake uncontrollably. Due to the fact that even her biological reactions to stress were regarded to be potential evidence of her guilt, the guards meticulously chronicled her physical symptoms. Throughout the course of the investigation, it became abundantly evident that Catherine's fate had already been previously determined. Considering the pattern that the king had previously established with unfaithful women, there was little room for uncertainty regarding the outcome. The only question that remained was whether she would be afforded the mercy of a private execution or whether she would be subjected to the public spectacle of being burned at the stake as a traitor. The judicial machinery that would destroy Catherine Howard was set in action with the same merciless efficiency that had defined Henry VIII's prior marriage scandals. Catherine Howard was the victim of this machinery. In order to condemn the Queen without the need for a formal trial, Parliament was called upon to approve a bill of attainder against her. This was a legislative process that would condemn her. This bill of attainder was a distortion of English legal tradition that allowed the king to circumvent normal court procedures when dealing with instances that touched on royal prerogative. In situations when she might have been able to provide a defense, she was unable to do so. Rather than being sentenced by a jury consisting of her contemporaries, Catherine would be punished by a parliament that existed solely for the king's pleasure and dared not take a stand against his desire. The accusations that were intended to be brought against Catherine were meticulously formulated in order to guarantee her demise, while also avoiding any admission that the king himself had been misled or made a mistake in judgment. As a result of her treacherous behavior, she was accused of concealing her previous relationships prior to her marriage, indulging in adultery with Thomas Culper, and collaborating to imagine the death of the monarch. The testimony of her former lovers, which was extracted via the use of torture, her own letters to Culper, and the testimony of servants who had witnessed or assisted her secret meetings were all included in the evidence that was brought against her. This evidence was given as proof that there was a purposeful conspiracy to betray the monarchy and engage in deception against the king. Both Thomas Cowper and Francis Darnham were subjected to their own trials and condemnations, and in the end, both men were sentenced to the standard death penalty for traitors, which consists of hanging, drawing, and quartering. It is possible that Cowper was granted the mercy of simple beheading due to his superior social rank or the king's lingering sympathy for him. On the other hand, Darnham was subjected to the full savagery of the death of the traitor. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rowford, posed a one-of-a-kind legal challenge due to the fact that she appeared to have experienced a total mental collapse while she was incarcerated. According to English law, which has long held that mad individuals cannot be killed, this provided a unique legal challenge. By enacting a special statute that declared that insanity was not a defense against treason, Parliament was able to resolve this problem and make it possible for her to be executed. As a result of the fact that no member of Parliament dared to speak in defense of a queen whom the monarch had already condemned, the bill of attainder against Catherine was able to pass through both chambers of Parliament without major resistance. The swiftness and uniformity of the parliamentary procedure proved that the legislative body of England was completely subservient to the despotic will of Henry. The final days that Catherine Howard spent in the Tower of London shed light on the brutal nature of Tudor justice, as well as the incredible bravery of a young lady who was facing the prospect of her own death. She was transferred to the Tower on February 10, 1542, and she was confined in the same apartments that had housed in Boleyn 6 years previously. This was a purposeful psychological torment that underscored the fate that was waiting for queens who were unfaithful. Sir John Gage, the lieutenant of the Tower, was given the directive to treat Catherine with the respect that is due to her royal status, while also making certain that she was unable to escape or hurt herself prior to her execution. The preparation for the judicial murder was surrounded by an atmosphere of surreal politeness, which was formed by the delicate balance that existed between security and civility of the situation. The manner in which Catherine conducted herself during her final days came as a surprise to many people who had only known her as a foolish. A young woman who was mostly interested in clothes and court celebrations demonstrated a level of decorum and composure that impressed even her guards when she was confronted with the certainty that she would go to her last breath. Praying, reading religious literature, and making spiritual preparations for the end that was waiting for her were the activities that she engaged in during her time. The most heartfelt request that the young queen made during this time period was for the executioner's block to be brought to her room so that she might rehearse the proper way to place her head on it. Her wish to die with dignity, as opposed to the hysteria that had characterized some of the past royal executions, was the driving force behind this macabre rehearsal. It is said that she spent a considerable amount of time perfecting the placement that would enable the headsman to carry out his function in an effective manner. The final letters that Catherine sent were dictated to her attendants because she was not allowed to write. In these letters, she expressed real regret for her conduct while also reiterating that she was innocent of the most serious allegations that were brought against her. Although she admitted that she had failed to disclose her previous connections prior to her marriage, she denied that she had committed adultery while she was in the role of queen or that she had plotted against the life of the king. The condemned queen also used her final days to make provisions for her slaves, expressing appreciation for their devoted service during her captivity and demanding that they be cared for after her death. She also made a request that they be prepared for her death. A level of maturity and selflessness that had not been apparent throughout her brief reign was shown by the fact that she was concerned about the well-being of others in the face of her own impending death. On the evening of February 12, 1542, Catherine was notified that her execution would take place the following morning. This information was delivered to her. Instead of eating the meal that was offered to her, she chose to spend her last night in prayer and meditation. The priests who attended her supplied her with the spiritual comfort that she greatly needed. In the brief and terrible life that she lived, her ability to maintain her composure during these dying hours will be remembered as the most outstanding example. Not only was the execution of Catherine Howard, which took place on February 13, 1542, carried out with the same brutal efficiency that had marked Henry VIII's prior judicial killings, but also displayed the astonishing bravery of a 19-year-old girl who faced death with surprising serenity. The execution was planned to take place at dawn in order to diminish the number of witnesses and lessen the likelihood of the general public feeling compassion for the queen who was being executed. Catherine was directed to the scaffolding that was located within the walls of the tower, which was the same spot wherein Bullen had ultimately met her end 6 years previously. The executioner was a French professional who had been brought in from France. He was selected because of his expertise in guaranteeing a speedy and clean death, as opposed to the botched beheadings that sometimes occurred as a result of hiring headsmen who lacked experience. Witnesses included officials from the tower, representatives of the monarch, and a few courtiers whose participation was required by convention. The gathering of witnesses was rather modest. There was permission for Catherine's own servants to be present, and their subsequent reports supplied the most vivid depictions of the times that she spent in her final moments. Catherine approached the scaffolding with steady feet and no obvious signs of panic. She was dressed in a black velvet gown and a white kirtle of the same color. Her serenity amazed even those who had come to witness her humiliation rather than her bravery, and the signs of terror that she displayed, as well as her prepared stance on the block, revealed the care that she had done to prepare for this moment. The final speech that Catherine delivered was concise and adhered to the standard protocol that is anticipated of royal executions by the public. She admitted that she had committed transgressions against the monarch. She asked for prayers for her soul, and she expressed forgiveness to those who had been responsible for her ultimate demise. She did not make any attempt to declare her innocence or to beg for compassion, because she was aware that such actions would be fruitless and would only serve to prolong her misery rather than alleviated. The execution itself was carried out with a single blow, presenting the French executioner with the opportunity to demonstrate the expertise for which he had been selected. After months of being held captive, being questioned, and being subjected to psychological torment, Catherine Howard passed away, putting an end to her misery. Immediately after her death, she was laid to rest in a grave within the chapel of the Tower, leaving her in the same position as in Boleyn and other individuals who had been affected by Henry's matrimonial paranoia. Almost immediately after Catherine's death, Jane Boleyn, also known as Lady Rochford, was put to death, bringing to a close the elimination of all of the most prominent persons concerned with the scandal. It was clear that Henry would go to any extent to remove everyone associated to his wife's supposed treachery, as seen by the fact that her execution took place despite the fact that she appeared to be extremely insane. The death of Catherine Howard brought an end to the brief period of time during which the Howard family had regained power and influence. After some time had passed, her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was also found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. However, he was spared from death only because Henry himself passed away the night before his scheduled execution. Henry's tolerance for the family's goals had now been exhausted as a result of the family's continuous involvement in royal scandals. The actual essence of Henry VIII's reign was shown by the merciless efficiency with which Catherine was executed, as well as by the meticulous elimination of everyone connected to the crimes that she was considered to have committed. It was not justice. Rather, it was the arbitrary exercise of total power, where the king's wounded pride was sufficient justification for the judicial murder of a teenager whose worst offense may have been falling in love with someone her own age. That was the case. It was a clear reminder of the risks that confronted anybody who ventured to cross Henry VIII or become engaged in the hazardous world of royal marriage. The repercussions of Catherine Howard's execution resonated across English society, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers that faced those individuals. His subjects were given a strong message about the penalties of betrayal, whether it was actual or perceived, through the speed and thoroughness with which the monarch had killed his fifth wife. Following the dutiful passage of the Bill of Attainder that condemned Catherine without trial, Parliament moved swiftly to handle the legal ramifications of the most recent matrimonial calamity that the king had caused. Henry's relationships with women were characterized by paranoia and insecurity, which was shown by a regulation that made it treasonous for any woman to marry the king without first divulging her whole sexual history. This statute was adopted when new laws were enacted. The autumn season was also quite important. Her Catholic relatives had thought that her influence would lead to the restoration of traditional religious practices. However, her shame and execution instead strengthened the standing of Protestant reformers who had planned her downfall. Her execution further strengthened the position of Protestant reformers. The humiliation of the Howard family turned out to be a win for those individuals who advocated for England's separation from Rome. The manner in which Henry responded to Catherine's execution was one that was typical of his callousness and self-interest. Instead of expressing any regret for the murder of his adolescent wife, he blamed her fully for deceiving him and depicted himself as the victim of feminine wiles and Catholic plot. He refused to express any remorse for the loss of his wife. The fact that he was able to portray himself as the victim of the crime while simultaneously ordering the judicial execution of a young woman who was only 19 years old was illustrative of the complete lack of moral accountability that defined his reign. The lessons that were learned from Catherine's case were something that informed the subsequent search for a sixth wife that the king conducted. His eventual marriage to Catherine Parr was preceded by intensive inquiries into her background and character. She was chosen in part because her maturity and Protestant principles made her less likely to participate in the kind of amorous escapades that had ruined her predecessors. His marriage to Catherine Parr was ultimately successful. Because of Catherine's destiny, the broader impact on English society was substantial. This was due to the fact that it reaffirmed the absolute nature of royal authority and the weakness of even the highest-ranking subjects when they fell out of favor. The aristocracy was aware that neither noble blood nor royal marriage offered any protection against the king's fury. This resulted in a climate of terror and subservience that would continue to be characteristic of Henry's reign for the remainder of his reign. Despite the fact that historians are continually re-evaluating Catherine Howard's story and the consequences it has, the historical legacy of her execution is still evolving. The traditional narrative that depicted her as a promiscuous adulteress who brought about her own destruction via immoral behavior and poor judgment has been called into doubt by modern historians to a greater extent than ever before. Catherine's tale has been reframed by contemporary feminist research as that of a victim of systematic abuse and exploitation, beginning with her inappropriate sexual connections as a young adolescent and concluding in her judicial murder at the hands of tyrant husband. This reframe indicates that Catherine was a victim of abuse and exploitation throughout her entire life. This interpretation places an emphasis on the power inequalities that influenced her life and the fact that she was unable to get genuine permission from the men she was in relationships with because they were older and more powerful. There is still debate among historians over the topic of whether or not Catherine was actually guilty. While there is ample proof that she had other relationships prior to her marriage, the evidence that she committed adultery with Thomas Culpeper is not as conclusive. Her letters to him, albeit having an intimate tone, do not directly acknowledge to having committed physical adultery. Furthermore, Culpeper's own confession under torture may have been aimed to diminish his crimes rather than provide truthful testimony. The legal methods that were utilized to sentence Catherine have been generally denounced by contemporary scholars as a distortion of justice. As evidence of the arbitrary nature of Tudor justice when it was used for royal objectives, the use of parliamentary attainder rather than judicial trial, the acceptance of testimony obtained under torture, and the establishment of new statutes explicitly tailored to secure her conviction are all examples of this. It has also been re-examined in the context of child sexual abuse, and many historians now acknowledge that Catherine's early encounters with Henry Manox and Frances Darham constituted statutory rape, according to contemporary standards. This is something that has been re-examined in the aforementioned context. Therefore, her later behavior as queen can be interpreted not as evidence of intrinsic promiscuity, but rather as the predictable effect of both traumatic experiences and exploitation that she had as a kid. In addition to shedding light on the human tragedy that Catherine Howard endured, the broader ramifications of her destiny shed light on the systematic subjugation of women in Tudor society. She describes how women's bodies and sexuality were regarded as political commodities, and how they were subject to continual observation and control by male relatives, husbands, and the state itself. Her story sheds light on this phenomenon. The story of Catherine Howard continues to captivate people for a variety of reasons, including the intrinsic drama it contains and the fact that it continues to be relevant to contemporary conversations about power, consent, and justice. As a view into a world in which youth and beauty might raise a woman to the highest position in the land, only to become the tools of her destruction when they failed to satisfy male goals and wants. Her brief life and terrible murder serve as a window into that world. One of the most devastating illustrations of how total power may corrupt absolutely and how the innocent can be ruined by forces that are beyond their knowledge or control is the tragedy of Catherine Howard, which remains as one of the most tragic examples in the annals of history, not only as a source of entertainment, but also as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked authority and the precarious position of those who lack power in societies that view them as expendable. Her fate serves as a reminder that behind every historical statistic is a human being whose suffering deserves to be remembered and understood.